The cameras showed smiles and handshakes. But behind closed doors, what did Africa's leaders really think of their meeting with former U.S. President Donald Trump? From awkward moments to bold statements, this exposé reveals the untold side of the Trump-Africa summit. What really happened inside the Trump-Africa meeting? While the public saw formal greetings and speeches, sources suggest that African leaders expressed raw and honest opinions behind the scenes. In this eye-opening exposé by InspirAfrica official, we uncover key highlights from the Trump-Africa engagement. What African leaders said off-camera. Private opinions versus public diplomacy. What this meeting means for U.S.-Africa relations in 2025 and beyond. Prepare to see this political summit like never before. Key highlights from the Trump-Africa engagement. On July 9, 2025, U.S. President Donald Trump hosted a working lunch at the White House with the leaders of 5 African nations: Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and Senegal. This selective summit, described as a multilateral lunch, marked a significant moment in Trump's second-term Africa policy, emphasizing a shift from traditional aid to trade-driven engagement. Key highlights include focus on commercial opportunities. The White House emphasized commercial opportunities as the central theme, with Trump highlighting Africa's great economic potential, particularly its natural resources like manganese, uranium, lithium, and oil. The meeting aimed to secure U.S. access to critical minerals and counter China's growing influence in Africa. CNN.com, New York Times.com, Reuters.com. Transactional diplomacy. Trump's approach was overtly transactional, prioritizing bilateral deals over multilateral frameworks like the African Union. The administration signaled a departure from charity-based aid, with Trump announcing the closure of the U.S. Agency for International Development (USAID), which historically allocated 40% of its budget to sub-Saharan Africa. Economist.com, Reuters.com. Selective invitations. The choice of only 5 African nations, excluding major players like Nigeria, South Africa, and Ethiopia, raised eyebrows. Analysts suggest the selection was strategic, focusing on countries with untapped resources and alignment with U.S. interests, such as migration control and mineral access. And P.Art.org, Brookings, edu. Peace deal references. Trump and the African leaders referenced a recent U.S.-brokered peace deal between Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, which facilitated U.S. access to Congolese mineral rights. This was cited as a model for trade-driven diplomacy. CNN.combc.com. Migration and visa issues. Trump pressed the leaders on safe third-country agreements to address African migrants overstaying U.S. visas, particularly targeting Mauritania and Gabon. Migration was a key discussion point, especially for Senegal and Mauritania, which are transit hubs for illegal immigration. New York Times. ComBC UK. What African leaders said off-camera. Off-camera remarks by African leaders are not extensively documented in public sources, as such conversations are typically private and sensitive. However, based on the context of the summit and expert analyses, we can infer the following. Strategic flattery. During the televised portion, leaders like Mauritania's President Mohamed Ould Ghazouani and Liberia's President Joseph Numa Boakai praised Trump's peace efforts, with some endorsing his nomination for a Nobel Peace Prize. Off-camera, these leaders likely continued this flattery to align with Trump's transactional style, focusing on their country's resources to secure favorable trade terms. BBC.com, Reuters.com. Concerns about tariffs. With the U.S. imposing 10% tariffs on goods from these nations, leaders likely expressed private concerns about economic impacts and sought exemptions or reduced rates. For instance, Guinea-Bissau's President Umaro Sissoko Embalo, facing domestic political challenges, may have emphasized his diplomatic triumph to bolster his position at home. BBC UK. Migration pressures. Analysts suggest that leaders from Mauritania and Senegal, key migration transit points, privately discussed U.S. demands for stricter visa compliance and deportation agreements. These discussions were likely tense, as Mauritania's lack of diplomatic ties with Israel, a U.S. ally, was a sticking point. BBC, ComBC, UK. Resource bargaining. Leaders from resource-rich nations like Gabon, manganese, uranium, and Senegal, oil, gas, likely pitched their assets to attract U.S. investment, emphasizing mutual benefits while navigating Trump's America First agenda. Brookings, EU. Without direct leaks or reports, these inferences are based on the leaders' public statements and the summit's agenda. Off-camera, leaders likely balanced flattery with pragmatic negotiations to secure economic benefits. Private opinions versus public diplomacy. The contrast between private opinions and public diplomacy was stark, reflecting the high-stakes nature of the summit. Public diplomacy. In the televised lunch, African leaders adopted a deferential tone, praising Trump's global peace efforts and highlighting their nation's resources. For example, Gabon's President Brice Oligui Nguema stated, "We are not poor countries. We are rich countries when it comes to raw materials," aligning with Trump's trade-focused narrative. This public flattery was strategic, aimed at securing U.S. investment and goodwill. Reuters.com. Private opinion. opinions. Privately, leaders likely harbored concerns about Trump's unpredictable style and the implications of U.S. aid cuts. The dissolution of USAID, which supported 2.6% of Liberia's gross national income, was a significant blow. Leaders may have viewed Trump's transactional approach as a double-edged sword, offering investment opportunities but risking long-term economic dependency on U.S. terms. PBS.org. South Africa precedent. The earlier May 2025 meeting with South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, where Trump made baseless claims of white genocide, likely heightened private wariness. African leaders may have feared similar confrontations, prompting cautious diplomacy to avoid antagonizing Trump. Edition, NN.com, NewYorkTimes.com. Geopolitical calculations. Privately, leaders likely discussed the growing influence of China and Russia, which offer fewer strings attached compared to U.S. deals. For instance, Guinea-Bissau's recent military cooperation with Russia suggests leaders are hedging their bets, balancing U.S. engagement with other global powers. Brookings, EDU. This dichotomy reflects a broader trend. African leaders publicly align with Trump's priorities to secure deals, while privately grappling with the risks of reduced aid and U.S. dominance. What this meeting means for Africa relations in 2025 and beyond. The July 2025 summit signals a pivotal shift in U.S.-Africa relations with long-term implications. Trade over aid. Trump's closure of USAID and emphasis on trade marks a departure from traditional U.S. soft power strategies like PEPFAR and AGOA. The trade, not aid policy aims to foster economic self-reliance but risks alienating nations dependent on U.S. humanitarian support. Economist.com. Brookings, EDU. Competition with China and Russia. The summit underscores U.S. efforts to counter China's $296 billion trade dominance in Africa compared to $71.6 billion for the U.S. By focusing on critical minerals, the U.S. aims to secure supply chains, but its bilateral approach may struggle against China's regional strategy via the African Continental Free Trade Area. Brookings, Brookings. AGOA uncertainty. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, set to expire in September 2025, faces an uncertain future. Trump's administration may push for a revised AGOA favoring U.S. interests, potentially excluding nations like South Africa due to geopolitical tensions. Brookings, EDUCSIS.org. Security and migration. The focus on safe third country agreements and visa overstays indicates a U.S. priority to control African migration, which could strain relations with transit nations like Mauritania. Security cooperation, particularly in counterterrorism, remains a U.S. interest, but reduced military presence in the Sahel may limit influence. Atlantic Council, OrgAPnews.com. Long-term risks. The transactional approach may yield short-term deals, but risks long-term U.S. soft power. China and Russia's growing presence, coupled with African nations' increasing global options, could marginalize the U.S. if it fails to balance trade with diplomacy. Brookings, EDUForeignPolicy.com. Trump-Africa meeting exposed. The notion of the Trump-Africa meeting being exposed likely refers to controversial moments that drew public scrutiny. Trump's interruption. A widely circulated video showed Trump interrupting an African leader, urging them to go a bit quicker to adhere to the schedule. This was criticized on social media as humiliating, highlighting Trump's blunt demeanor. HindustanTimes.com. English comment controversy. Trump's surprise at Liberian President Joseph Bokai's English proficiency, despite English being Liberia's official language, was dubbed a national embarrassment. This moment underscored perceptions of Trump's limited understanding of African contexts. HindustanTimes.com. Selective invitations. The exclusion of major African powers like Nigeria and South Africa fueled speculation of a U.S. strategy to sideline BRICS-aligned nations. This raised questions about the summit's inclusivity and motives. DanPR.org. Aid cuts backlash. The meeting occurred amid backlash over USAID's closure, with estimates suggesting 14 million additional deaths by 2030 due to reduced health funding. This context framed the summit as a pivot to trade at the expense of humanitarian commitments. Reuters.com. These moments exposed the summit's transactional nature and Trump's unconventional diplomacy, sparking debates about U.S. intentions in Africa. Official agenda. What was announced? The official agenda, as per White House statements, centered on commercial opportunities to benefit both the U.S. and African partners. Trade-focused diplomacy. Trump announced a shift from aid to trade, emphasizing U.S. investment in African resources like manganese, cobalt, and lithium. No specific deals were publicly detailed, but the agenda prioritized bilateral trade agreements. NewYorkTimes.com. Reuters.com. Safe third country agreements. Trump pushed for agreements to address visa overstays and deportations, targeting Mauritania and Gabon. Details remained vague, but these discussions were a key focus. NewYorkTimes.com. Peace and security. Trump highlighted his administration's role in brokering the Rwanda-DRC peace deal, positioning trade as a tool for conflict resolution. He also expressed interest in addressing anger on the continent, though specifics were absent. NPR.org. PBS.org. Future Summit. A broader U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit was mooted for later in 2025, potentially in September, to expand engagement with more African nations. HindustanTimes.com. No concrete policy announcements such as tariff exemptions or new investment packages were made public during the lunch. Behind-the-scenes moments. Behind-the-scenes insights are limited, but key moments include pre-summit preparations. The White House coordinated with the 5 nations to focus on resources and migration, reflecting strategic planning to align with U.S. priorities. Reuters.com. Personal relationships. Trump's Africa policy is influenced by personal ties, including South African-born advisor Elon Musk and senior advisor Masad Boulos, whose Nigerian business connections shaped discussions. Chatham House, Org Atlantic Council or tense negotiations. Off-camera, leaders likely navigated Trump's demands for trade concessions and migration controls, balancing domestic pressures with U.S. expectations. BBC UK. Media management. The televised portion was carefully staged to project unity, with leaders' praise for Trump likely rehearsed to avoid confrontations like the Ramaphosa meeting. Edition. NN.com. Leaders' reactions caught on camera. On-camera reactions included flattering speeches. Mauritania's Ghazouani led with praise for Trump's peace efforts, followed by similar remarks from Senegal's Bassirou Diomaye Faye and Gabon's Brice Oligui Nguema, who highlighted their nation's resources. PBS OrgAPnews.com. Awkward moments. Trump's interruption of a leader's speech and his comment on Bokai's English drew visible discomfort, with leaders maintaining diplomatic smiles. Hindustan Times, ComaPnews.com. Unity display. The leaders' collective endorsement of Trump's Nobel Prize nomination was a staged show of support, reflecting their strategic alignment. BBC.com. What African diplomats really said. African diplomats' remarks, beyond the leaders' public statements, are less documented but include concerns over aid cuts. Diplomats privately expressed alarm at USAID's closure, noting its impact on health and development programs. One diplomat described the situation as chaotic due to unclear U.S. policy directions. Politico.com. Skepticism of U.S. motives. Some diplomats viewed Trump's trade focus as a guise for securing U.S. mineral access, with limited benefits for African economies. Brookings, EDU. Weak diplomatic core. African embassies in Washington, poorly funded, struggled to engage with Trump's team, limiting their influence on the summit's outcomes. Politico.com. Trump's surprising remarks. Trump's notable remarks included English comment. His surprise at Bokai's English fluency was widely criticized as ignorant, given Liberia's history. APnews.com. Trade as diplomacy. Trump stated, "You guys are going to fight, we're not going to trade," linking trade to conflict resolution. Hindustan Times, ComPS.org. Africa's potential. He described Africa as having great economic potential and very valuable lands, a shift from his first term's derogatory remarks. PBS.org. Migration focus. His push for safe third country agreements surprised some leaders who expected a purely economic focus. NewYorkTimes.com. Impact on U.S.-Africa relations going forward. The summit's implications include erosion of soft power. USAID's closure and reduced funding for programs like PEPFAR weaken U.S. soft power, potentially ceding influence to China and Russia. Brookings, EDU. Bilateral focus. Trump's preference for bilateral deals may fragment African unity, challenging the African Union's regional approach. Brookings, EDU. Economic opportunities. Strategic U.S. investments in critical minerals could boost African economies, but only if mutually beneficial. Brookings, EDU. Geopolitical risks. Tensions with BRICS-aligned nations like South Africa could isolate the U.S., while migration and tariff policies may strain relations. And PR.org. Future engagement. The proposed 2025 summit offers a chance to broaden engagement, but success depends on addressing African priorities beyond trade. HindustanTimes.com.